Hello there. Welcome to my weekly meditation. And know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. This is a weekly video that I do for my congregation in South Burlington. And so if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and you find this video helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, or share these videos with anyone you feel called to.
Our reading for today comes from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30 and 36 through 43. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the household came to the master and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in the field? Where then did these weeds come from? And the master answered, An enemy has done this. The slaves said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you will also uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then he left the crowds, and went into the house. And Jesus' disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Jesus answered, The one who sows good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And the good seed are the children of the kingdom, and the weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers. And they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen.
Hello, sisters and brothers. This week I'd like to talk about this passage from Matthew 13. And this is a parable where Jesus continues his comparison between us as children of God and the world that we live in and our relationship with God to grain, wheat, weeds, fire. These are agricultural references that Jesus makes to his followers all the time because it contextualizes things in a way in which people are able to understand. And I think that as we wrestle with a reading like this, it's important for us to try to do our best to contextualize it in a way in which we can understand. That is the way in which we continue to make the gospel real within the world today. And I say that because this passage has some ideas in it that I think are going to be hard for us to digest. And I feel that it's important for us to be honest with the scripture, especially when Jesus starts talking about things like the end of the age and sorting out evildoers from good doers and burning them in fire. Jesus definitely had a strong opinion that a day of judgment would come, and this would be a day where God's justice would be imposed upon our imperfect world, and all that was wrong would be made right. And while I do think that time has shown that that day of justice, that day of judgment, may be a little bit further out than maybe some of us would like, or maybe some of us are totally comfortable with, I also feel we need to really contextualize what Jesus is saying, because in a lot of ways I think that the way in which Jesus is talking about our actions and the consequences of those actions and our ability to challenge ourselves to do good, I think that that's very real. And we're kind of seeing a little bit of judgment in our lived lives today. I'm looking out my window of my office, and there is a hazy fog of smoke that is coming from wildfires in Canada. And just the other day, I remember driving home, and the sun was like glowing red through all that fog, and it really did look like something that would freak a person out in Jesus' day and age as a time of judgment. I also think we need to recognize the biblical level flooding that's been hitting Vermont these last couple of weeks and recognize that we really are living through a moment where our decisions as a people, a human civilization, are coming back to really bite us in the butt. And that, in a way, we are reaping a lot of the short-sighted, bad decisions that we have made over the past century. So while Jesus may not be talking about Judgment Day in a way that looks like the book of Revelation, or looks like the movie Left Behind, I do think that Jesus is sharing with us a message that if we're not going to commit ourselves to living lives that bear the grain of goodness that can nurture this world, then I don't know if we can expect this world to continue nurturing us. So what Jesus is telling his disciples and followers here is that our actions have consequences, and that those consequences can either be good or bad based off of how we choose to live our lives. The parable that Jesus is telling his disciples here in Matthew 13 is one that is meant to make people aware of this reality, that we are a part of this field that is called the world, and there is both good and there is bad in it. And I think that we make the mistake of latching on to the elements of this parable where he says the good will be brought to the barn and the bad will be burned in fire. I think that cut and dry depiction overlooks the reality that our lives are a mix of good and bad. And if we want to see good come from the world, we need to not just sort the good people from the bad people. We need to sort out the good in our lives from the bad in our lives. And so when it comes to this time of judgment, I think that there are two ways in which you can look at it. If we are committed to putting bad things into the world, then that time of judgment is going to be bad. But if we're focusing on maximizing the good that we can do for the world, then that time of judgment really is a time of transformation where things get better. And what Jesus is trying to encourage his disciples here to do is to maximize the good that they're putting into the world so that when that time of judgment comes, things do get better. We get to join God in the barn as opposed to suffering through the consequences of bad actions. I think we really do need to pay attention to the good that we do and the bad that we do, but I think we also need to pay attention to the times of judgment that we receive within our lives, because I feel another part of this passage that may be misleading is the idea that there's only one time of judgment, that once Judgment Day hits, that's the end. And maybe sometimes it feels like the end. For instance, when the temple in Jerusalem was burned for the second time by the Romans, a lot of people in Jewish society was like, oh, that's it, that's the end. But honestly, life continues. The story continues. After Jesus was crucified on the cross, a lot of people were like, oh, that's the end. But the power of Jesus' resurrection, and really where Christianity finds its power and it is rooted, is the idea that love doesn't stop when bad things happen to us. Rather, we adapt and we grow and we find new ways to bring love into the world. Jesus was telling people within his time period that human society, in a lot of ways, is a mixed bag. There are a lot of things that we do that are not loving, that are not kind to our brothers and our sisters, that are unjust, and we need to correct those things, otherwise bad things are going to happen. But at the same time, he was saying that we have the ability to change those things. And it's not just something that we need to fix from the top down. We can do that by changing the way in which we live our lives, by sorting out the bad things that are within our lives. And I think that if we're looking at this sorting situation that Jesus is talking about, this reaping, then we probably should think about it less as throwing people into the fire, because as a person who grew up in a congregation that was descended from the Puritans, I can tell you throwing people into fire is not a good thing, and it doesn't look good for the church at all. But rather, if we're talking about throwing those things that draw us away from God, those bad habits, those uncaring actions, our inability to see the hurt and the suffering of other people and to address those things, I'm totally fine throwing those elements of my life into the fire so that I can have the things within my life that bring me closer to God, that bring me closer to my brothers and sisters, that bring me closer to my family, and make me a more loving person come out. I think that in a lot of ways is what the church is supposed to be. The church is supposed to help us to sort out those things in our lives that probably should be burned away so that we can have something more loving left behind. That is not an end, but rather it is a beginning. And I think that we find ourselves going through these times of judgment time and time again. We could have learned something from the 2008 financial crisis, where housing prices went nuts, considering that we are now in a situation nowadays where housing prices are nuts. Maybe we could have learned a thing or two and avoid ourselves some suffering. People don't always learn from their mistakes. However, as we find ourselves in a situation where people here in Vermont are in need of assistance building their lives back up, perhaps we can learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past, and we continue to struggle with issues of finding homes, transitional shelters for people to live in as they get their lives back up. We continue to struggle with trying to make it so housing prices are more affordable here in Vermont. We continue to struggle with making it so people have access to health care. We're struggling to make sure people have access to high quality education or even childcare. We're finding it hard to provide for one another, and now we find ourselves in a situation with the flooding where people have to provide for each other. We are in a situation where our society, our communities, our infrastructure will literally cease to function if we're unable to do that. How can we learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past and do right by our brothers and sisters here in the present? Judgment Day, I don't think, is an end to the story, but rather it is a transitional moment where we either are rewarded for the good that we've done, or we struggle with the mistakes that we've made. One way or another, we can learn from those times of judgment. One way or another, we can become closer to God through those times of judgment. It's just sometimes those times of judgment hurt, and sometimes those times of judgment bring joy. But we do not need to necessarily fear those times of judgment. Rather, we need to work towards them. Because if we're willing to commit ourselves to love, if we're willing to commit ourselves to creating a field that is life-sustaining, plentiful, joyous, and just, then we are going to transition into something that is beautiful. But if we're not able to do that, then we're going to transition backwards. And if there's anything that Jesus tells us about God, it's that God is actually kind of patient when it comes to dealing with God's children, dealing with us. Because God does recognize that we are a mixed batch. We're a mixed crop. And sometimes it takes us time to sort out those things in our lives that are not beneficial and should be burned in fire, and those things in our lives that we need to hold on to and that bring love into the world and help us be the type of people that God knows that we can be. It's a parable. It doesn't always read well, but I do think that the intention in which Jesus gives it to us is from a place of love. And it's meant to build understanding. And so it's good for us to struggle with passages like Matthew 13, because I do think through the struggle, we build understanding. Just like with these times of judgment, through the struggle, we can build understanding. Peace.